What made me write my book? Back in 1996, I think it was, an American golf course architect by the name of Tom Boak came out with a book all about golf course architecture. And one of the chapters was on the classic age of the classic golf course architecture between the years 1900 and 1930. And he listed there all of the famous architects at the time, American and British. Stanley Thompson was not mentioned once. And I decided then that someone should write a book about Stanley Thompson, have it published in America, and people would then get to know something about Stanley Thompson. So I wrote a book about Stanley Thompson, called it the Toronto Terror after one of his many nicknames. And since then, I think people have got to know much more about Stanley Thompson in America as well as in Canada than they knew before. So that's the answer. A very good question.
I'll use Jim's preamble if he doesn't mind, so we can save a little time. I think in general I'd played golf since '81, which is fairly late in life, I agree, or admit, but I think I had an appreciation early on that I liked some courses better than others. And when I found out that Stanley had done all these ones that I had seen and read about and heard about, it started falling into place. But it wasn't until I saw a little two-liner in 1999 in a newspaper about the Stanley Thompson Society that I really started thinking seriously about it. And I joined the society, and I got involved in just exactly and how much this man did for Canadian golf, that I started thinking about my own course, Cataraqui Golf and Country Club in Kingston, which goes back to 1917. He showed up in fall of 1931. So I got intrigued at that, and I spent 3 years doing a book on the evolution of the golf course. And through that, I learned a lot more about Stanley, and I was involved in the society at that time. So that's where my serious interest came in Stanley and his work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my appreciation of Stanley Thompson really began when I was probably 11 or 12 years old, before I even knew who Stanley Thompson was. And I can remember this very vividly, caddying for my father at Midland Golf and Country Club. And there's some debate over whether Thompson really designed it or whether it was Nicol Thompson, but I think he had some involvement there. But I remember, and it was a 9-hole course at the time, and I remember caddying for my father and just falling in love with the environment, the setting at Midland. And that really inspired me to get involved in the game of golf. And I had a friend on my hockey team that talked me into caddying the following year at Bayview Country Club, which was a Robbie Robinson course, one of Stanley's disciples. And I didn't know at the time that Robbie would also have such a tremendous influence on my life and my career in golf. And I caddied there for a few years and ended up saving enough money to join a club, and I joined Uplands, and I had no idea it was a Stanley Thompson course, but enjoyed playing there for all my junior years. And there were some nights when me and my friends would hop over the fence and play a few holes at Thornhill, another Stanley Thompson course. So just playing in tournaments at a number of his great courses, St. George's, Westmount. I really started to gain an appreciation for golf course design and what went into, making a great golf course. And so I decided to study and pursue a career in golf course architecture, and was fortunate enough to hook up with Robbie Robinson very early in my career and spent 8 years working with him, and really gained a lot of insight and knowledge about Stanley Thompson's work and a little bit about his personality and character just by working alongside Robbie Robinson.
Both my parents were from Winnipeg, and as everybody knows, you've got two parents, and you like them both and so forth. And I kind of polarized towards my father, like he being somewhat of a snob. and he came from one side of the tracks, and my mother came from sort of the middle of the tracks. But I learned later on that the Thompson family was perhaps more interesting, or as interesting, as my father's family. My mother was a Thompson. Her father, my grandfather, was one of Stanley's brothers. So later on, I decided I was going to do a book about Thompson and his architecture, having now reestablished myself as a sort of Thompson, if you will, and I became very interested in what he had done. And then I got scooped by Mr. Barclay, of course, with his wonderful book. So my wife said to me, "Dear, would you please get back to your day job?" So I did that, and then I kept thinking about Thompson and that he had come to the conclusion that he was a great person, as was the family itself in terms of golfing. So one winter night, I think 1997, I wrote a note to myself about forming the Stanley Thompson Society, which we did in 1998. So to answer your question more directly, Karen, my interest obviously came from my mother. It was a much later in life interest, and it developed and grew. And today I now know him better than I did when I was an 8-year-old, when we used to visit him at Guelph.
Well, I guess from my perspective as a golf course architect, I think you know, his courses that he built across the country and in other parts of the world and in the United States are really his legacy that he's left behind for not only people like myself, golf architects, but golfers. I think you know, the golfing public around Canada have, and some of them may not realize they were designed by Stanley Thompson, but they certainly would recognize that they are fabulous, interesting, and beautiful pieces of work, or really pieces of art that he's left behind for people to enjoy for generations, and hopefully that will continue into the future. But I think that's his biggest legacy, or is the work that he left behind.
Well, he also left behind, too, a number of people, from Robert Trent Jones through Jeffrey Cornish and Moot and many others, including Doug Carrick. In other words, he left a number of disciples in a lineage, if you will, that have carried on his work. And I don't know whether that exists anyplace else. It's a very interesting influence that he had, and probably, when you think about it, quite profound. When he, in the late 20s and early 30s, during the height of the Depression, he built a practice probably as modern as any today. There were no computers, but he had all sorts of disciplines on staff, one of them being Robert Trent Jones, who we hired right out of college. Howard Watson was another, and so forth. So his contribution probably is more than just his golf courses. It's the work that Doug is doing and many others of his generation.
Yeah, I think Jeff Cornish did a family tree of the various architects that were practicing around the turn of the century, from Donald Ross, you know, Tillinghast, and Stanley Thompson. And I think Stanley Thompson's family tree of architects that are practicing or have practiced is probably one of the largest,
Yes,
maybe next to Donald Ross. It's quite large, quite a broad influence, as you.
I think also, before John or Jim say something, before, I mean, the architecture is one thing, but his family, all 9 of them, all 8 of them, 9 of them, 9? 5
9.
brothers, 4 sisters, yeah. Were all dedicated in some way to golf, particularly the brothers. And the Thompson family were called the Amazing Thompsons, sometimes the Toronto Terrors, not just for their golf prowess, but I discovered later on they were absolutely dedicated to the game of golf as a family. And one of the things that I think Stanley has given us is a sense of fair play in regard to his risk and reward, strategic game. Anybody can play his golf course at any handicap level. And he always said that he built golf courses for the duffer, not for the president of the golf club and so forth. So I think public golf, in some sense, was a very important part of his legacy.
If I could just step in for a moment, I think that you mentioned this just a minute ago about the average golfer, or the golfers appreciating different things, and I think his courses certainly stand out in most people's minds, not necessarily because they know and understand the architectural part of it, but there's something about the look of them that is pleasing, and they just like to play. Cataraqui is a classic example, I think. Stanley Thompson did not do a full 18 holes. He did a renovation, and he added holes to get it up to 18. Well, actually, they had 18 holes before that he showed up, but he built 11 holes from scratch at Cataraqui, and he built and modified and tweaked a little bit some of the other holes, the other 7. But if you ask anybody who's played Cataraqui which holes, which 9 they like, the answer is invariably the backside, and that's 100% Stanley. The back 9. So there's definitely something about the look of his courses that pleases, and as Bill alluded to, the duffer as well as the top quality player. The record score at Cataraqui, for example, is 64. It's par 70, and that record stood from 30 or 40 years now. Actually, historically, it stands until 2 years ago. It was broken with a 63. That's 7 under par, and it's only 6,400 yards long. So that gives you some idea that there's something more to length, which is another subject I suppose we can get into later on.
It's only in recent years that the role of the golf course architect has been appreciated fully. I was reminded of that when I was reading the history, a pamphlet put out in 1955 by Niagara Golf Club in Winnipeg when the Canadian Open was held there. Very good pamphlet of about 30, 40 pages. It mentions everything except who was the designer of the course. It shows diagrams of the course, hole by hole. The name of Stanley Thompson does not appear anywhere, which is significant, I think, and we have to ask ourselves, why are we now so much more interested in golf course architecture than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago? And I think we have to hand a great deal of our thanks to Jeff Cornish, who was one of Stanley Thompson's workers, who assisted in bringing out a book called The Game of Golf.
The Architects of Golf?
No, that was the second edition.
That was the second
The golf
edition,
course.
that's right.
The golf.
The golf course, yeah.
The golf course in 1981, I think it was, and they followed up 12 years later with The Architects of Golf. It's a massive book. It lists something like 10,000 golf courses, tells you who designed them, gives you small biographies of the architect, and photographs as well. And that was a bestseller. Went to several different editions, I'm quite sure. And I know it was invaluable if you wanted to find out who designed what and where. And it also had a prefix that told you something about golf course architecture. What was the science of it, the skills in designing it, what were the difference between holes that were there for the high handicap golfer and for the low handicap golfer. I think Cornish and Whitten did a very good job in that,
Yeah.
and they probably brought the architect to our notice much more. Well, they were the first to bring it to our notice, I think.
Yeah, I
Do you-
agree. I think also television has had some impact on that with some of the tournament golf that we're seeing, and I think also some of the work of Pete Dye, because it was so different than what was going on at the time, maybe brought a little bit of recognition to architecture as well. I think one of his greatest abilities or skills was he was able to capture a different character in each hole of the golf course. I know when I was playing golf, and even today, when you play his courses, you can remember each hole quite easily. and he had a real knack for capturing the unique character of a piece of landscape on each hole. And just in the way he arranged his bunkers or captured a view, or where he sighted a green or situated a tee to capture a panoramic view, he seemed to have that ability to create 18 very unique holes that you could remember after you've played them, and yet the whole golf course had a continuity about it. It tied together. Aside from presenting you with a variety of different shots, I think that was one of his great skills in golf course architecture.
He was regarded as a master of routing, the ability to, he'd walk through the woods with a hatchet and he'd mark things and so forth, but he had phenomenal memory. And I remember speaking to Jake Milligan, who was the superintendent during the Jasper days, and he was sick at the time, but I had a conversation with him. And he said Stanley would go out on the golf course and he'd come back. And he'd come back to Jack's cottage at Jasper. And he said he would write out things for me in great detail of what had to be done and so forth. Then I suspect I went in the garden shed, which was still there when I was there, and had a few drinks and so forth, and probably had it out because Mr. Milligan said, I didn't like him very much. He always called me Patty, you see, so he was upset about that. But anyway, Stanley had a phenomenal ability to route things and see things. And if you think about a Stanley Thompson golf course, whenever you're on a tee or a green, as Doug said, there's always a view, a vista of some kind. And he made notes of where birds nested and so forth, so people would hear sounds. And so in that sense, he was a naturalist.
Yeah, I remember Robbie telling me once an experience he had with Thompson when they were doing Westmount. And he said they went out to the site and they tromped through it was solid forest and bush, and they tromped through the site for several hours. And Robbie said he was completely lost. He didn't know where he was. And they got back to the hotel room and Thompson laid out the aerial photo on the floor and he started routing the golf course. And he was describing all these features that they had seen on their walk through the forest. Well, Robbie, you remember that little draw through there? We'll route the fairway through there. We'll put the green up on this little rise. And Robbie said, geez, I was totally lost. I couldn't remember any of that stuff. And then he found out a few weeks later that Thompson had studied this aerial photo for weeks before he went out to the site.
But he wasn't only an architect. He had more skills as well. I think he was a serious artist. He could visualize things, and you mentioned that he used views very effectively. And he used the traditional artistic things like emphasis and balance and harmony and rhythm, and you could see that on his holes. So I think this is why people, when they see one of his courses that hasn't been modified significantly, that still has the flow and the movement that he put there originally, I think they're happy. And I think this is a major element to the game of golf.
He used, I think, a lot of Japanese landscape architectural principles, the main one being borrowed landscaping, where you bring a view into where you're sitting, if you will. And Jasper is a very fine example of that, where he used the surrounding mountains to give you views and so forth. And Doug and I were talking about this earlier, that he probably borrowed the shapes on the snow peaks and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed similar things at Jasper, where outcroppings of sand and grass, which are very reminiscent of his early bunkers, capes, and flashes. So I think in that, he certainly was an artist, and there's a very good example. Jasper, it probably is his most artistic endeavor.
Well, Highlands Links is well up there, though.
Yep,
if you read
sure.
any articles about Highlands Links is one of his classics, because he definitely did that there, apparently. I haven't seen it yet, but my sons are taking me down for a golf trip this August for my 70th birthday, and we're going to play Highlands Links. So I'm going to have a real look at it.
I didn't know you were 70.
I shouldn't have admitted a thing like that in front of all these people.
When Graham Cook was redoing Highlands Links, these magnificent views had been lost through just junk growing up and so forth. And he had a hell of a time convincing Parks Canada to cut this brush out and return the views. But finally, he overcame.
I think his greatest skill was in capturing clients to finance his courses.
Yeah.
When you think of when you think of all of his best courses, not one of them was financed by members of a golf club. St. George was financed by CPR, and so was Jasper and Banff. Highland Links was financed by
Federal government,
the federal government, the people. Yeah. And if you look at all of his best courses, the ones he overspent grossly on all of them. By some accounts, he spent $1 million, I think it was, in building Jasper, and that runs for 3 or 4 months a year. That was his greatest skill, I think, in doing that and spending the money for them. And he did it very, very acutely.
There's no question he was a great salesman. Robbie had a lot of great stories about Stanley, and one I remember him telling about Banff. And you talk about the courses going over budget, and he was halfway through construction of the course, and it had gone way over budget. And I think it was Cornelius Van Horn, who was the CEO of CP at the time. And he came out, he was furious. He was ready to shut the job down because they were spending so much money and the course wasn't finished. And Robbie said that he said to Cornelius, look, let's go for a walk. Before you decide to do anything, let's just go for a walk. So they went off for a walk. And I guess he took him up to some vantage point overlooking the golf course, to show them what they were working on. And he said, after about 3 hours, they came back to the compound arm in arm smoking cigars. And he had his money to finish the course. So he must have been a smooth talker.
Yeah. There was a similar story at Mayfair in Edmonton, and he'd been asked to come and visit the course, and he had been working on it, and he came back, and the secretary-treasurer said, and Thompson expected a check. He always liked to pick up checks in these little trips because he was constantly out of money. So the secretary-treasurer said, I'm afraid the directors aren't very happy with you, Mr. Thompson. Well, why is that? And, well, they just don't like the course. So he said, let's take a tour. So I went out and had a tour. And Thompson said nothing on this tour, and he came back, and he listened to them. And they said, see, Mr. Thompson, what we mean? He said, gentlemen, this is beyond my wildest dream. And with that, the secretary-treasurer was ordered to cut a check, and Thompson promptly left town. So
one thing I mentioned the book that Cornish and Whitten wrote. They have Stanley down as being born in Scotland in 1894. And Stanley led all of his associates to believe he had come from Scotland. In fact, his parents did, but not he. He was born something like 10 years after they arrived in Canada, but he fooled them all. And perhaps I can tell you something about his parents, because Bill, you've come across clubs signed by Nicol Thompson.
Yes.
He spells Thompson without the P, Thomson.
It was not unusual for people misspelling.
No, you speak for yourself. In fact, Stanley's father was a Thompson without the P. He came from a little village called Middlebury, which is in Dumfriesshire in the southeast corner of Scotland. And he was a ploughman. And Stanley's mother was Jeannie McCrone, and she was the daughter of a blacksmith. And when they were married, Thompson's name, by the way, was James Thompson without the P. When they were married, something went wrong with the marriage certificate. Someone added the P, and ever since then, there have been Thompsons with the P. But Nicol Thompson was born 4 months after the wedding. And probably what happened was his birth certificate was spelt correctly without the P. And that's why you'll find on some clubs in Canada, Nicol Thompson clubs, you'll find he spells his name without the P. They came to Canada and they settled down in a little village called Norway. Norway is on the Kingston Road, now part of Toronto Golf Club, now part of Toronto. And it was adjacent to the Toronto Golf Club, which then had its course on next door to the village of Norway and up, what was the road? What?
Kingston Road.
Kingston Road, no, Woodbine Avenue. So all the Thompson brothers, being very living right next to the coast, became caddies, and hence they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the 5 of them became caddies there. And that was the beginning of the Thompson career. They learned golf at a very early age by watching and by listening and by paid 30 cents a round, I think it was, something like that.
There's a sketch in a book, I can't remember which one it is now, that shows Stanley standing against the wall and his brothers shooting golf balls at him inside the house. This was a practice session, so it shows you how fanatical they all were as golfers.
That's a Toronto Star thing. It's in Jim's book, and it's also in my book as well. And my mother used to tell me that story, and I remember telling that story to Rick Fraser, the Toronto Star, who was a golfer and a golf reporter. And he said, "Give me a break. What do you mean?" And I said, "That's true. My mother told me this, and she should know." And he said, "I don't believe this. You're telling me that your grandfather used to hit golf balls off the buttons of the blouse of his brothers?" I said, "They did this all the time." So anyway, Fraser never forgave me for that. Well, he's a family trait, no question. They were great storytellers, always embellishing the truth. They loved to party. They were talkers. They would sit and rock, and I mean literally, and talk. And the sisters were magnificent people and great storytellers, and all interesting business people. I knew the brothers, with the exception of. I met all the brothers with the exception of Frank and Bill. But Stanley, he's just fictional. I mean, who said that, Jim? What was that quote from Hillis Pickens? Anyway, there's a very good quote about he was larger than life, he was fictional, and so forth and so forth. So I think he was, I think they were characters from the day they were born. It's just part of the Thompsons thing.
I think that's how he got the name of, what was it called? The Amazing Thompson, and also, what do I call my book? I've forgotten the title now. Tronatara, yeah. Good question, Tronatara.
Did not the press name him, give the family the name?
Yeah, well, he used to tell the press one story one year and a different story the following year. One of his anecdotes is that he told the press one year that the Duke of Windsor, who was playing at, I think it was Jasper or Banff, hit the ball into the river 8 times off the tee.
One of the things that, I just remember what I was going to say, that people didn't know about Thompson, he was shy, and when he got excited, he stuttered, and had quite a bad stutter, but only when he got excited or flustered, or cornered, I suppose.
Robbie told me a story about that too, and I think it was a meeting at Summit Golf Club. And he said that, from time to time, Stanley would stutter, like you say, and if somebody else stuttered, it would start him stuttering. So he had this meeting with the board of directors at Summit, and one of the directors had a stutter. And of course, this got Stanley going. He started stuttering, and I guess this guy got quite upset. He thought he was making fun of him.
I think also his war experience made him stutter much worse. So they tell me anyway, that he came back. He was in the Canadian Royal Artillery. He was a
spotter. Yeah.
A spotter, a spotter. Up front, but he got shell shock. Yeah. Before the First World War, his brother Nicol had teamed up with George Cumming, who was then the professional at Toronto Golf Club, and they designed a few courses, the two of them, and Stanley joined them around about 1913, helped to design 2 courses in Muskoka area. He went to He went to what is now the University of Guelph, but only for about 9 months. Learned things nothing to do with golf course architecture, but about how to feed chickens and things like that. Now, when he came back from the war, the First World War, he joined up with Stanley Thompson, he joined up with Nicol Thompson, George Cumming again, and they formed the club. Thompson, Nicol, and Thompson, Cumming, and Thompson, the three of them. And they were so busy that building new courses that Stanley branched out by himself. The 1920s was probably the busiest of any era when it came to building golf courses. Canada had something like 130 golf courses at the end of the First World War, and by the end of the 1920s, it's 600. So the rate of expansion is easily surpassed in those days, and it's never been the same again. Stanley formed his own club, his own company in 1921, I think it was. And in those 10 years, in the 1920s, he built 2/3 of the golf courses that he ever finished completely. So, but then came the 1930s and the very bad years of depression, and things got pretty tough. But he kept on at it, but beyond the 1920s, I think he was finished with all the great courses. He finished, I think, when was Capilano was 1935?
36 it was finished.
36, well, yeah. But that was the last of the great ones, I think. I'm sorry? Highlands, I'm so sorry, Highlands, you're quite right. Highlands Links.
I'd put him on a par. I'm a rookie at this, and I'm sure Doug has more scientific reasons for his comments. But I would think that he's on a par with Tillinghast and Ross.
And Mackenzie.
And Mackenzie.
Yep.
In fact, I have a letter from that Mackenzie wrote after he visited Jasper after Thompson had finished it.
29.
He calls it, and yes, it was dated 1929. He considers it, this is another architect talking about a competitor, and he's saying that this is the best golf course he's seen
In the world.
in the world, and he names the places he's been.
Yeah.
So I think that's I put him right up there with the rest of them. He's less publicized perhaps than the others, but this is the purpose of the society.
Every one of his peers wrote and spoke very highly and kindly about his ability and his golf courses. It's, I think, probably one of the interesting things is that his golf courses, the great ones, such as St. George's, they all stay in the top, if that's a measuring stick, of the top 100 in Canada. And I'd love to see if that happens with other courses of other well-known architects in their part of the world, if you will.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you think of the age of the courses, that he's done. They've more than stood the test of time. I would put him, as you say, in the top 5 of all time. Maybe the top 3. He was a remarkable architect.
I think he probably built the most expensive courses as well.
But there are still 100 of his golf courses, an approximate number. There's still approximately 100 of them in Canada. And as Bill says, there's anywhere between 5 and 10 of his. Still, every 2 years when they do the ratings for Canada, he's still there. And if you consider his disciples in that list in Canada, the percentage goes up to 30 or 40%. So there's certainly something different about the whole scene that was involved in.
Well, they've stood well the test of time if the damn green committees would leave them alone. And there's a remarkable thing happening today is that a lot of these courses have been desecrated for all the wrong reasons. Yet there's a remarkable sympathetic restoration taking place right across this country. And I'd like to think that the Thompson Society has had a little bit to do with that, and thank goodness it's happening. And certainly my course, Dundas Valley, if you can believe it, a classic Thompson course has one fairway bunker, period, you know, because the others have been closed out because they didn't want to maintain them or the president didn't like them. And it's irritating. And I remember being at Mayfair and having a tour, and suddenly we came upon this hole that had, I said, I thought Thompson was the architect, not Pete Dye. And she said, what do you mean? I said, this is a Pete Dye green complex with railway ties. So we went in a little further, and I said, let me tell you how this happened. Let me guess how this happened. She said, okay. I said, you've got one or two wealthy members, and they winter in Florida, and they saw this, and they came back and said, we've got to have this in this parkland golf course with pine trees and so forth, and they had the money to build it, and they built it. She said, that's exactly how it happened. So anyway, there's a remarkable sympathetic restoration, a lot of it thanks to Doug Carrick, going on across the country.
We certainly ruined St. George's Course in the 1960s in order to get more length to it. We were told we couldn't get the Canadian Open unless we made it more difficult. We had to lengthen it, and in doing so, we ruined 4 or 5 of Thompson's finest holes. But as Bill was saying, we have to thank Doug and his company for restoring them to what they were like 20 years ago.
Well, Ian Andrews sitting in the room here, he did a lot of that work
Yes. Thank you, Ian.
at St. George's Gym. So he's had quite a bit of experience too on a lot of Thompson's courses, and certainly has been sympathetic to his work.
It's quite a challenge restoring a course. First of all, you need to know what it looked like beforehand, and there aren't very many people living it in the earlier Thompson courses that have the memory or are still around that knows what it looked like. So the problem of finding out what you should be trying to go back to is a first thing you have to worry about, and how you do it's another one, but that's much more straightforward. But the use of air photographs, which incidentally, I believe Stanley Thompson was one of the first to start using air photography and viewing sites from the air for his purposes. I believe he was the first. Yeah. If not, he was right up there. But he recognized instantly that this was the way to go. But if a course and a club is fortunate enough not to have had a fire in their clubhouse, which is, I'm afraid, not very common. Most of them were burnt down. Cataraqui was burnt down in '73. We lost everything. Records, our trophies. I think we have, Evan, we have one trophy left, a couple of silver trophies, but history of most clubs is that you lose the records, or they're very hard to find. And without those records, it's really a challenge to figure out what to do. And unless you know what the principles were, if you don't have any access to any of these things like air photography or old photographs, what you end up doing is having to understand what his thought processes were, and being lucky enough to find an architect like Doug and Ian that can implement it and say, well, this is what it would have looked like. You know, that's where the sympathetic restoration part comes in.
Yeah, I think luckily enough there are some of his great courses and pieces of his work that are still intact for the most part, that you know, you can sort of gather what his style was from. You know, his bunkering style was probably his biggest trademark or feature that distinguished it as a Thompson course. And you know, Cataraqui and Capilano and their other examples where a lot of those features are still intact. And you know, those are great things for architects such as ourselves to look at and study and try and capture the, you know, the style or the spirit of his designs, if it has been lost on some of his courses. So.
Our course was built by the Royal York Hotel. It was called the Royal York Golf Club originally. And they must have spent a lot of money in photographs. I think Ian will tell you they were invaluable in restoring St. George's to what it was like 50 years ago.
Right.
And the McNaughton collection. Yeah.
There's not probably a better documented club that I know of.
But the McNaughton collection came from Royal York. They were photographs financed by Royal York Hotel, when you think about it. And you probably find them invaluable when you were restoring it, Ian?
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of that stuff's starting to show up, funny enough, through eBay. of all places. A lot of the history is starting to come around. People are starting to realize things that they have. So, for example, Robert and myself bought all the opening year photos of Jasper just recently, and I've just given discs out. But a lot of that stuff's starting to show up. So some of the history is starting to come back, some of the things we had lost. The thing that I think we'd all like to see is the models that Stanley made, though. That's the one that sort of leaves us all, the one thing we wish we could see.
I saw one, Ian. When I was 8 years old, when we were visiting Stan at Dormy House, I remember, first of all, the ping pong table, which he used as a sand table to sculpt holes. And I actually saw him do this with his cane when he wasn't happy. Behind that was a map of Canada with red pins with all his projects. And then there was a model. It was paper mache, and I forgot about it. And it was years later when I remember this, and this really prompted me to start the Stanley Thompson Society. I remember what it was. And it was a model, paper mache model of Banff. And so I asked myself at the time, what trash can did this end up in? With some kind of dedication to making sure it didn't happen again. So I did see one of those models, but I don't remember it that well.
Yeah, there aren't too many of his drawings around. I know that Thornhill Country Club still has some good original green sketches of Thompson's hanging on the walls, yeah.
Well, Sunningdale, some years ago, Sunningdale in London, some years ago, I had a message from the president of the company that owned that property, and the golf course superintendent found a booklet, a notebook in one of the sheds in the maintenance area, and it was handwritten by Stanley. It had sketches of the greens. There was write-ups as to what he had in mind for the hole. He had calculations on the green areas. He'd sketch out the green shape and the mounting and the bunkers around it, and then he'd split the green area up in triangles, and his calculations are all on the side as to how he calculated the area of this thing. It was all there, and we have a copy of that as well. But
If I recall on one...
yes.
A lot of that stuff actually on our website for people, they can look at it.
Yes, that's a good point, Ian.
Isn't it the same booklet that where at one page he listed the number of drinks he was having each day? I think it is. And the ounces,
Oh, maybe I was mistaken. Those calculations, that's all. We're not the area of the grade.
Those triangles
Those are the numbers.
martini glasses.
That's right, upside down.
We're just about coming up to the break, and I want to give you an opportunity if there's a story that you specifically had framed that you wanted to share before we open the floor. Although I think maybe we've already opened the floor. About Thompson that you think we haven't mentioned. I know Jim asked me a few weeks ago how I was going to fit in a story about what was that? Was it the pea story that you've already told?
That's a very good question. I have no idea.
Well, I have one, not my own experience, of course, but John Parkinson, who is a member of Thornhill. I had the pleasure to play golf with him in one of the Stanley Thompson annual tournaments, and he related his experiences to me as we went around the golf course of his summer of 1947, when he was Stanley's chauffeur for the summer. And after the tournament, I sent him an email, and actually I guess it was a letter, but I asked him if he wouldn't mind putting down his recollections in writing for the benefit of everyone. And he very graciously did. Not only that, but he included a photograph of this great big Buick, which apparently came into the country for a one-time off, have something to do with the Roman Catholic Church. Was it the Pope or was it the
Bishop of Boston?
There was a fairly significant individual coming into town, and they got this big Buick in. Well, Stanley acquired it somehow. And this 47-year-old, or at least in 1947, I think John Parkinson was 16 or 17 at the time, and he was a chauffeur for the summer. So he got to drive this great big machine around the country, which included cross-country when he got to a golf site. Like this one story that Parkinson has is down at Whirlpool, and they're driving through the rough country. The golf course is in the process of being laid out. Stanley's standing up in the back of this convertible. It was a convertible, standing up in the back of it, and then he tells John Parkinson to stop. of course, Parkinson, a sharp young fellow, decided if he hit the brakes, Stanley was going to go straight off the front of the vehicle. But anyway, they finally did stop, and Stanley never fazed him at all. He just asked him to back up a little bit because he'd overshot the thing he wanted to look at. So I think that's a measure of the man. And the other thing about that particular recollection is that Stanley would go up north or probably around Lake Simcoe on the weekends, and John Parkinson would drop him off on the Friday night and give him the car for the weekend. Here's a 16 or 17-year-old driving around locally in the back roads with a great big convertible Buick, which must have attracted, I would think, a fair bit of attention. But I think that's an interesting anecdote about Stanley, that he actually, these sort of things didn't bother him at all. If it was my son asking me for my car at that age, I don't know if I would have done that.
I have two stories that are from Robbie that were my favorites. One was when they were building Capilano, and I guess Robbie was out there with them on this particular visit. And they were up at the clubhouse site, and Thompson was looking out over the course, and he said, "Robbie, those trees down there are blocking a nice view from the clubhouse here. You better send the men down to cut those trees." And Robbie said, "Well, we can't. They're not on the property." He says, "Robbie, send the men down and cut the trees." So he didn't want to lose his job. He sent the men down, and they cut the trees down. The next day, the local sheriff shows up looking for Thompson and couldn't find him. So he said, "Well, I'll be back tomorrow." Came back the next day, still no Thompson. Third day comes back, and Thompson happened to be there, and the sheriff finally catches up with him, and Thompson says, "Oh, you're just the man I've been looking for." You know, he says, "Come on up here, I want to show you what we're doing." He says, "Well, Mr. Thompson, you've been cutting trees off the property. I'm going to have to take you downtown." He says, "Well, come on up, I want to show you what we're doing." He says, "Isn't that the most glorious view you've ever seen in your life? You're looking out over the Burrard Inlet down to Vancouver." He said, "Mr. Thompson, you carry on, but no more cutting trees off the property." And the other one that Robbie told me that was funny was when they were building St. George's, and I guess it was called the Royal York Golf Club at the time. And Thompson had sent, it was Robbie's first day of work, and he had sent his chauffeur out to pick up Robbie. And I guess Robbie thought that he was going to be supervising, a number of crews of men. And when he arrived on site, he caught up with Stanley, and Stanley said, "Robbie, pick that wheelbarrow up and go help those guys build the green there." And he was quite disappointed. So anyway, they went through the summer building the course, and I guess as they were getting close to the end of completing the course, Thompson said to Robbie, "Well, what do you think of the golf course that we're building here, Robbie?" And Robbie said, "Well, Mr. Thompson, it's a magnificent course, but I think it's too difficult." And he said, "Young man, I'm not building this course for today. I'm building it for posterity." And he was a visionary. That's what he was. So I like those stories.
That's right.
Thank you. This is probably for Jim or Bill. Where do you think Stanley learned his ability to create golf courses?
He had the opportunity to see, I told you he was a member, he lived adjacent to the Toronto Golf Club. In 1913, Toronto moved from where it was then, the Kingston Road, to where it is now in Mississauga. And Stanley had the opportunity to visit, to witness the British architect called Colt, who was sent out to lay out the new golf course for Toronto Golf Club. And I'm quite sure he was then, 20 years of age, 1913. So I'm sure he picked up a lot of hints by watching Colt, first of all, lay out the new Toronto Golf Club. And also, a few years later, Colt laid out the new course for Hamilton Golf Club, where Stanley Thompson's brother, Nicol, was the professional. So right away, he had the opportunity to see how golf courses should be laid out, or as they were in Britain. I think he learned a lot from that. He also learned a lot about the turf of golf courses, I'm quite sure, from George Cumming. George Cumming came to Canada in 1900 had been a well-known professional in Scotland, not just a professional, but a greenkeeper as well. He had to do both jobs. And he was a great teacher. He was looked upon as one of the experts on turf in Canada from the time he came in 1900 until his death in 1950. So Stanley worked with him, of course. So learned a lot about not just designing golf courses, but looking after the turf of golf courses from George Cumming.
Yes, in Canadian Golfer, there's quite an article that George Cumming wrote on turf building.
Yes, it is. A five-page
I think
article.
it was quite appropriate that Stanley was involved in the production of a number of golf courses, which you called the prohibition golf courses. Was that because of Stanley's other situations with the enjoyment of
No, I
liquor?
don't, I'm not sure about that, but certainly it was very important. But there was, as you all know, America and Canada made drink illegal around 1919. Canada lifted it very quickly, but there was prohibition in the States till 1933. And all the golfers of Detroit had nowhere to drink. So Stanley built them a few golf courses on this side of the border, and they were very popular. I think you visited one in Vermont? In Vermont?
Yes, in Vermont.
Where the golf, the,
View, I think it was
Rich, yeah, something like that. Richford. The golf course itself was in the States, but the clubhouse was in Canada. So, and I think you visited that, didn't you, Bill?
Yes, and when I went through, they said to me, this was, the winter was just starting, and the courses were closed. And they asked me what I was doing, and I told them I was visiting your golf course. And
Yeah.
they says, it's closed. I says, yes, but I'm seeing it for historical reasons. And they said, what do you mean, historical reasons? I said, that was a prohibition course. And of course, he had no idea. He said,
Did he not?
He had no idea about prohibition.
Well, I'm sure the liquor is much cheaper in the States now, so I don't think the clubhouse would be very well appreciated.
You mentioned in your book, the Scottish invasion one, I think, that during the war on leave, Stanley and Frank would go and look at outstanding English and Scottish golf courses. And I think you mentioned that, and
Yes.
that's perhaps where they would pick up quite a bit.
They would indeed. Unfortunately, I haven't come across any record of which ones they did visit, but I'm sure they went to St Andrews. I would guess they would head right for St Andrews. But unfortunately, nobody made a note of exactly which ones they went to. This was in, yeah. They did it during leave, when they were on leave during the First World War, and also after the war, they made a point of going to visit some, and I'm sure they included probably the ones done by Colt as well, the architect who came across to do Hamilton and Toronto.
I think I read in one of your books about the war years is that soldiers were given free playing time at the various golf courses during the war.
Yes, there were. Particularly in near the. No, I'm trying to think of the name of the area where they had all the tents. With the Salisbury Plain, that's it. Yeah, there are many courses round about there, and they were allowed to play for nothing. We haven't said much about Stanley Thompson, the golfer, and perhaps we should say something. The fact that he was a brilliant golfer. All five brothers were first-rate golfers. Stanley Thompson's one brother won the Canadian Amateur twice, and Frank, and Bill won it once in the early 1920s. This was before the days of Somerville. But Stanley was reckoned by many to be the best golfer of all, and he was pretty good. In 1934, he got into the semi-finals of the amateur when he was, the Ontario Amateur, when he was, what, 41, 42 years of age. Yeah.
He used to play with 5 to 7 clubs?
So
it wasn't the standard number of clubs. It seems to me in your book there's some reference,
Yeah.
you make some
5
reference to the
clubs.
number of clubs that he played with.
Well,
When he was a low qualifier.
he was a low qualified. He said he only used
World
5 clubs, but
World.
it's hard to believe that he only used 5 golf clubs. But It was mentioned in the newspapers, but they happened to be stolen just before he took part in one of the Canadian Open. Someone pinched his golf clubs, and that year he came in leading amateur in the Open. So.
He was low medalist, wasn't he?
I'm sorry?
He was low medalist.
Yes.
A low medalist, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if he borrowed only 5, wouldn't that suggest that he only had 5 in his bag in the first place?
I couldn't say. I refuse to speculate.
Are your facts wrong?
No, I'm not fact. I merely quote a newspaper. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't believe everything I read in newspapers, but
Yeah, just curious, if you were to take a person who had never played a Thompson golf course to one course, which would it be and why?
I wouldn't take him to my course because I'd have to pay the green fee. No, I take that back. I would take him to St. George's, no, I wouldn't. I would take him to Jasper or Banff. Undoubtedly, Jasper or Banff. Yeah.
Is that because of the design per se, or the setting, or?
The setting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think if I was doing this and I had an unlimited budget, I'd take the individual. We're talking about one player?
Yeah,
Well, it doesn't matter.
You know,
I'm not paying for it, so it doesn't matter. I would take him on a Thompson tour. I'd certainly, in fact, I have a map in my briefcase that has got all of Thompson's courses in Canada. And there's a natural falling out, or concentration of them. Around Toronto area, obviously they're the most. But you could do a Thompson tour around Lake Erie. He did 5 or 6 courses in Ohio that I've not seen any one of them, but they're written up in Jim's book that they're all quite close together. And they make a natural loop. There's a loop around Lake Simcoe. There's a loop in southwestern Ontario. So there's natural loops, but as far as the top courses, Jasper, Banff, and Capilano, and around Toronto, there'd be Westmount and St. George's. And Highlands Links, I've never seen Highlands Links or Old Ashburn in Halifax, but I understand that this was when he was in the top, was in his powers. That was in the 30s when he did those. So I think it'd be natural you couldn't do it in one course, as far as I'm concerned.
I don't think I would take him to any of the courses in the States because they were financed by the members and would not be amongst his best courses. Yeah. I've never seen them, but...
I think I would take him to Capilano. It's a magnificent golf course on a very difficult piece of land. It was one of the first golf communities, I think, built in North America. And he just did a brilliant routing, as you said, Bill, that he was brilliant at routing. And it was a very difficult property to develop and route a golf course on. It's probably got, 500 feet of elevation change on the golf course, and it's a walkable mountain golf course. And you really don't feel like you're covering 500 feet of elevation on that golf course. And it's just brilliant. And some of the shots that you get on the golf course there, and the backdrops and the ball hanging against, the city of Vancouver, or you turn around and you come back against Grouse Mountain. It's just a wonderful golf course. And it's still, for the most part, intact. There are a couple greens that have been rebuilt, but for the most part, it's still intact. And I think it's a brilliant golf course.
Doug, when you're my age, you won't find it walkable, let me tell you.
I'd probably take that person to 2 courses. I would probably, even though they're miles apart, I would take that person likely to Jasper, because I consider it to be his most interesting golf course. And that's a public golf course. And then I would take him probably there to Capilano, because it's a private golf course. And I would probably end up at Whirlpool, because it's a pure public golf course, if you will. And I think that person would see, despite the difference in terrain and the cost differentials, an amazing similarity between those 3 courses.
With the great ball strikers that we have out today, Tiger Woods, Vijay Singh, to name a couple, do you think Mr. Thompson would have changed his design specs now if he were to build a golf course today?
Well, that's also a very good question. I would like to think that, regardless of technology, that his design principles and his strategic approach to the game could apply to the modern game on the right type of property. The properties today are much different than they were then. And I think that would be a hell of a challenge. And next time I speak to him, I'll ask him if he'd like to take that challenge up. Would you like to partner with him?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he would, adapt the designs to today's game, the power game. But I think I agree with Bill that he would use the same design principles that he developed over his career. And they would still be very interesting golf courses to play. They just might be a little bit longer. But I think he intended his golf courses to be a test of golf for generations. And nobody can anticipate what's happened with the golf ball. Even for myself, in the last 5 to 10 years, what's happened with the golf ball, nobody could have anticipated that.
Here's an interesting example. I think it's an interesting example. If you take an average old-style course of about 64 to 6,600 yards on about 150, 55 acres, something like that. And let me come back to Dundas Valley, which is 145 and a half acres. There's one fairway bunker left, and that's on the 13th, and it's somewhat benign. It's a double bunker, but in order to bring the game into the modern era of the longer ball, that bunker could very easily and inexpensively be renovated but move forward, therefore bringing the risk and reward, leaving the risk and reward strategy there because there's a wonderful opening up the right side, which is what he did, giving the softer player, the less stronger player, an opportunity to play a different route. So I think that probably, and I think Ian and Doug might agree with this, is that on a lot of the courses, including St. George's, you can bring this back in simply by moving a bunker forward or changing the angle of a tee or whatever.
Or if there's room to move a tee back and leave bunkers in place. I think from an architectural standpoint and trying to preserve the integrity of his courses, if there's room to move a tee back and bring a bunker into play, that would probably be the way I'd prefer to do it. But that's not always possible, as Bill says.
Doug, you're laying out a new golf course in Scotland. How long is it off the back tees?
Which course, Jim?
The one you're laying out in Scotland.
7,100 yards.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Off the back tees?
Yeah.
But they use a smaller ball, Jim.
I don't think that the length of the golf course is the deciding factor. Stanley Thompson, I don't think he would go for a 7,500-yard golf course. As I mentioned earlier on, Cataraqui course record is 6 under par for ages, and it's now 7 under par, and it's 6,404 yards. The pros, when they played the Harry Colt course at Hamilton a couple of years ago, the winning score was 8 under, and that's under 7,000 yards, I understand. So I don't think length is, for a good, properly designed golf course, I don't think length is necessarily the single most important criteria.
Well, I think it's, and I'm not sure if Stanley thought this way, but he likely did, is laying out a golf course is presenting a variety of different shots and challenges to the golfer and making them use a variety of clubs in their bag. And, I've sort of studied yardages and, how far some of the better players are hitting the ball today. And I think you can accomplish that complete range of golf clubs through the bag from a wedge right through to your driver at about 7,100 yards. It's really the mix of holes and how you mix up the yardages on the par fours in particular, and the par fives, so that the golfer uses every club in the bag. And I figure that the ideal yardage there where you can do that is somewhere around 7,100 yards for a good golfer.
Is it not true that the pros, on the PGA Tour at least, have more trouble with the short par fours than they do? I know they're trying to drive them all now, the 340-yard par four, but they try to drive them. But I don't think they're scoring on those short holes is outstanding.
No, but and
Is
you're
that
right.
so?
You know, I think there is value in those short holes and how they're designed, and the difficulty that's presented at the green, or the tightness of the landing area. I think you can create those challenges and give those choices of, maybe driver isn't the right club to hit on those short holes. But I think, ideally you should test not only the short clubs but the long clubs as well. And you do that by creating a variety of lengths of holes, I think.
I think it's also important to remember that Thompson created courses for all levels of play. He did not necessarily set out to create a course for a championship. Although he of course was himself a very good golfer, he therefore would recognize the need to do this. But his courses could be played by anybody, any age, any handicap, because of his two-route principle and so forth. I think that that's what makes him such a great architect, is that you can play any one of his courses and not necessarily get beaten up. You can come out of there and be a very happy camper. And I don't think this happens at some of the newer courses. Obviously it happens beautifully at Doug's course, and Ian's courses, but when I see the stuff that's happening and you just hit the ball, go chase it, hit a little flip wedge in, whatever length the thing is, that's not the game, I don't think. And the bunkers get bigger and flashier and so forth. It's not the game. It's putting the ball to a point, working around a tree and so forth. And the really good players, the Corey Pavins, that's how they play the game.
I'd just like to maybe expand on what I think Bill, brought up a very good point. I think in a lot of Stanley's golf courses, he presented challenges for the average golfer as well. Banff is a classic example. The 18th hole there's a couple bunkers that maybe are 150 yards off the tee on the left side. And I remember when I played the course the first time thinking, well, why would he put bunkers there? But thinking about it, I think he put them there to boost the ego of a golfer, an average golfer. If you feel good when you hit it over a bunker. You feel like you've accomplished something. And I think he put carry bunkers in like that were very easy to hit over, but made you feel good about the shot you hit.
That's a great
And
point.
I think he did that purposefully on his courses.
So we can add psychologists to his list of
There you go.
attributes.
A bit earlier, someone used the term artist in reference to Stanley Thompson, and many great artists go through phases in their careers, and I wonder if there are clearly identifiable phases in the Thompson career, or was it a design style that was largely the same from start to finish?
I guess you could say rich and broke in his case.
Bill and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, and I think some of Stanley's early courses didn't have the flamboyant bunker style with the high sand flashes and the capes of grass. And really, I guess Jasper was probably one of the first courses where he developed that sort of style in his bunkering. And Bill and I were chatting about that, and maybe you could elaborate on that, Bill, what you think Stanley did when he was building Jasper.
I think, first of all, having studied natural landscapes in that area, I think that he was very moved by certain outcroppings of sand and grass, and if you study them and photograph them, as I have, at least photographed them, they're very similar to what he created. There's a hole, the first hole at Jasper, before they renovated the bunkers, there's a bunker in the fairway which is a very steep face and highly flashed, and there were rocks coming through the sand. This is before they renovated it. So I realized that his mounding behind bunkers was created probably from rocks that he took from the course. A lot of hand labor, you have to remember, so there weren't machines to carry the stuff away. He piled them up where he wanted them and then put earth and grew grass over them. But I couldn't figure out why the sand was so sticky and why it stayed there, or it had to be sticky to stay there. Then I learned that he'd taken sand from the Ascabatha River, which of course you could do any time today, couldn't you? Environmentalists would love that, yeah. So I went down to the river, some way into the woods, and I collected some sand, and sure, lo and behold, it was sticky. It was like glue, and it was thick porridge, and it stuck to things. So that's a theory which is yet to be proven, but I know he was definitely influenced by things he saw, and I saw similar things at Devil's Cauldron, at Banff, the par 3, which Nicklaus has called the best par 3 in the world, from the championship tee, which is closed down, and they may have reopened it. But in the woods, if you studied the mosses, again with lights and so forth, you could really see little miniature golf courses, little things happening. And I suspect he understood enough about nature and enough of an artistic streak in him to reflect on what was happening. And it probably created a lot of things in his mind, and that made him probably extremely artistic. Now, whether the odd sip of Canadian Club helped or not, I'm not sure. But his drawings, there are very few of his drawings left, but they're also very artistic. They've got a hand to them, they've got an emotion to them. And
Yeah. Well, I know Robbie, you know, and he pointed out Banff in particular, where Thompson looked up into the mountain peaks and studied the snow patterns in the mountain peaks, and maybe tried to capture some of that in his bunkering on the golf course. Try to bring some of those patterns down into the golf course, so there was a harmony with the environment that it was set in. And I think after Banff and Jasper, there was maybe some similarity in that type of flashing bunker style that he used. I think he repeated that certainly at Cataraqui and other courses, Thornhill and St. George's.
I have a question. I was just going to throw something in on the Jasper end of things. When you see the photos, the opening day photos, you'll find that actually it was fairly simple. There was no high flashes. Yeah. It turns out that he went back to Jasper and did a renovation after doing Banff. So sort of just a point of interest for people.
yeah, he went back in 29, I think.
Yeah, and they brought him back in because Banff was so overwhelming and so inspirational that they wanted something on the same level.
Right.
You'll find the bunkers are in the same places and the same scale, but what he did was from what I understand, a lot of it is when they were doing their renovations, they discovered that what he did was he simply topsoiled in to create all the noses and capes and produced the new bunkerings and then brought the flashes up. So what he did was he worked within the bunkering that he'd set up, but he added a lot more flair to them. Right. My question is to all four of you, what is the one Thompson hole you would pick out of all the holes to sort of explain something about him? And if you could pick that hole and then just talk about what we could learn from that hole.
Good question.
Well, first of all, I think every Thompson course should be walked backwards. You can learn a lot about what he does. But Banff, when it was restored, before it was restored, I made a point of going back to all the championship tees. For example, number 1, if you recall, is a wonderful golf hole. But from the championship tee, it's an unbelievable golf hole. I found the championship tee at the Devil's Cauldron, the par 3, which have been overridden with weeds and closed out. Magnificent golf hole. I mean, unbelievable golf hole. So I would say that certainly, from a Banff point of view, those two holes, in particular the number 3, and I agree with not having played all the par 3s in the world, I would tend to think that Nicklaus is right. That from the championship tee, that's one of the great par 3s anywhere. And you can learn so much from it because it's a classic drop shot. It's got all sorts of things that happen in terms of wind and other factors. It's a wonderful, wonderful golf hole.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, before you mentioned the Devil's Cauldron, that was one hole I was going to mention as well. I remember Robbie always used to say, you know, the par 3s are the glamour holes of golf, and I think he probably picked that up from Stanley Thompson. And you know, I think what he meant by that is those were the holes where you could really find the drama in the landscape and create something special. And certainly the Devil's Cauldron is probably one of his most famous golf holes of any of the courses that he's built. And you know, I think that was his philosophy. He even talked, well, Jim, you pointed out in your book that Thompson focused first on citing the par 3s in his layouts and then working around the par 3s. And you know, I think that's a great example of one of his philosophies is that hole, the Devil's Cauldron.
It also gives you a thrill. I mean, if you ever hit a golf ball from there, even from the forward tees, to watch the ball go up and up and up and up. I mean, it's exciting, and it makes you realize that the game itself is exciting.
Yeah.
because you don't know what's going to happen to the damn thing. It can end up in the
There's a
water,
lot
in
of
the woods.
anticipation.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Well, my experiences with par threes, Thompson's par threes, I haven't had the pleasure of playing all his courses in Canada, but I come back to Cataraqui, my home course, and the 15th hole is a 206-yard par three that is one of his classic risk-reward holes. I've always thought of it that way. But I always think of Lauren Rubenstein's comment on that hole, which was, it's the nicest four-shot par three in eastern Canada. And he said that in a newspaper article many, many years ago.
The third hole at St. George's is an excellent par three as well, I think. It's about 200 yards long, downhill. Big pardon?
Third hole.
The third hole, yeah.
Third hole, yeah.
What did I say? Third hole. Terrible green, you're right. Because it's not a Stanley
It's
Thompson
not a
green.
Stanley Thompson green.
We ruined it completely. It was half the size. He built a much smaller green, and we thought we were doing a very clever thing in 1968 by doubling the size of the green. And now it's a very unfair green. Stanley Thompson believed that on a green, 75% of the green should be available for the placing of the pin. On the present hole at St. George's, present par three, about 10% of the green is available for the placing of the pin. He also believed that when you were putting the ball into the hole, the ball should not accelerate as it passed the hole. At St. George's, you can putt it off the green quite easily, just by tapping the ball. It's a very unfair green. I've left a note in my will. I want that changed.
Typically, no, you don't. You might finish the golf course one hole at a time, but not build it one hole at a time, if you know what that means. It's built in stages. You know, your first stage might be clearing the trees off the land, and that might be occurring in a number of different places on the course. And then you move your earth, or you shape, you prepare your topsoil, and then you know, your irrigation, drainage, all that. As you finish the golf course, you may start on one hole and finish one hole at a time. When you're seeding out the golf course, you may start at one end and work your way out of the property. So the finishing would be done likely one hole at a time, but you don't necessarily build that way.
Would not the site dictate the sequence of events from a logistical standpoint?
Yeah, a lot of it.
Movement of
a lot of it
materials and-
determines on your access into the site, how you get equipment in and out of the site, and the configuration of the land, and you know where some of the constrictions might be in the property. But you generally start at the furthest point from your access when you're finishing, and work your way backwards. Doesn't always work that way, but that's the general strategy usually. But sometimes it doesn't work that way.
You guys have spent a lot of time talking about sort of the legacy of Stanley Thompson, his place in history and so on. If, not to be contrarian about this, but if he is as good as you say, why have we spent the last 50 years watching clubs take apart his legacy? Change his courses, change holes. We continue to do this to this day in varying degrees. And is there anything that can be done to sort of protect that legacy? And I know the Thompson Society is trying to do what they can, but it's sort of, there are great limitations on this. And a vast majority of his courses at this point are not intact. They're a handful that you would say have remained untouched since the point where he actually built them. Is there anything that can be done about this? Yeah. Should there be anything done about this?
Yes, I would fire all the green committees.
I'm with you on that.
I wouldn't just do that. I would try to re-educate them, or at least educate them in the first place. I think the directors and the Green Committee people might be good people in their own little businesses, but very few of them really understand what golf course architecture is all about and what they appreciate or don't like about what they're looking at. And I think that's a fundamental problem. If we re-educate them, I think that's where it all has to start, and that's where this sort of thing will stop. And that's one of the purposes of the society. In fact, we have an initiative that we started some years ago. We call them technical guides, where we have, was it 9 or 12 different
3 volumes.
articles? There are 3 volumes, we're near the end of doing it. We're getting close to production. But the purpose of those is to get green committees and directors to, help their education along all these points that we've been talking about today, and hopefully this will stop the erosion, so to speak.
Is it tough though, John, when you say that, when in fact Thompson's acolytes of the likes of Robbie, of Bob Moot, have been some of the guys who've taken apart his golf courses over the last 50 years?
Taken apart his golf courses, is that what you said?
Moved holes, moved greens, changed tees. I mean, we talked about St. George's at some length. That's just one example. Not knocking Robbie, Doug. I think it's an interesting, that it was his, in a lot of cases, it was his guys, the guys who did the work for him, who've altered his golf courses quite dramatically.
That may well be true, but I would hope they would do it in the spirit of Thompson. And I know Doug works this way, and Robbie worked that way. Bob Moot works that way, as does his son. But the truth of the matter is that greens and tees have to be moved for a variety of reasons. But you can still retain the integrity of the golf hole, the intent of the golf hole. I come back to Dundas Valley. I've spoken about Thompson for 8 years. I first said, where are the bunkers when I joined? Nobody had an answer. They thought I was crazy. They said, all you ever want to do is talk about Thompson because he's a relative. Now today, we're going to do a fairly major bunker restoration program. Only took me 8 years. That's not bad. But in the meantime, they had taken out all sorts of damn things. We've now got a tree management program. These are big steps forward, but to answer your question directly, it's the society that should take on this role of educating people, informing people, but we need oodles of money to do it, and which means advertising and media relations and so forth. It's no, as Thompson said, make no little plan, but it's not an easy task, and it takes money to do it, and one of the things, as John just mentioned, are these technical guys, and we're in the process of finding sponsors to finance these things because they're a whack of money. But if we can get these in people's hands ASAP, coupled with a good information communications program, we shall be successful.
Well, I think just to answer your question, Rob, I think there are a number of factors that influence, the need for change to these golf courses, and whether it's Stanley Thompson's or Donald Ross's or Tillinghast, every golf course, I think, goes through that kind of evolution. They're a living, breathing entity, and they change over time, whether it's through maintenance. Sometimes greens get smaller or technology improves, not only the equipment that golfers play with, but the equipment used to maintain the golf courses. That green heights have come down over the past number of years, and some of these greens are now unplayable, because they were designed for green speeds that were a lot slower when they were built. So there's a need for change, for adjusting. Trees grow that cause agronomic problems. Sometimes clubs get bad advice and changes are made that are not good, and you go back in and try and correct it or put it back, as you say, Bill, into the spirit of the original architect. But I think there's a number of factors that and I don't think it is saying anything about his ability or foresight as an architect. I think it's just a fact of life that golf courses change over a number of years, and they're going to require changes to be made over time. Yeah. And I'm sure it'll happen with my courses as well.
Do you think one of the solutions to protecting Thompson's legacy is an idea was floated around last week I thought was interesting, was making him a person of national historical significance?
We're in the process of trying to do that.
Yeah, because I found it a fascinating idea. If you want to speak to that, I'd be...
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 initiatives we're looking at. One is, not in any order or sequence, one is a stamp. The other is to get Parks Canada to begin to designate his courses as historic properties, heritage properties. We do this with buildings, but we don't seem to be able to do it with golf courses. He was a very significant figure in terms of Parks Canada. And there are other things that we're working on to try and provide more national prominence to him as a figure.
Yeah, I just have a question for Jim about St. George's. There was a rumor circulating that the original clubhouse was designed to be after the 1st and 10th hole. but was moved to the other side of Islington because it was a dry county. I don't know if you have any comment on that. I'd be interested to hear it.
And I believe Stanley designed it into 2 separate nines, as you say, with the clubhouse, not where it is in Islington, but after what is now the first hole, and between the first hole and the 10th hole. I couldn't find any proof of that, but I read that somewhere in a newspaper, but it's very hard to say.
I think I read somewhere that it got moved because it was helpful for them selling houses.
I think I wrote that, yes. Yeah, that's quite true.
Maybe, Jim, it was a prohibition course.
Well,
I find it interesting that, you know, in Thompson's own words of describing what he tried to, or what his ideal golf course was, and he talked about, you know, having the 9th and the 9th green and the first tee and the 10th tee and the 18th green by the clubhouse. But I think of all the courses he's done, Summit, St. George's, Thornhill, Capilano, none of them returned the 9th hole,
Yeah.
so
No,
he
that's
never practiced what he preached.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah.
I wonder if I just tell a very quick thing which would give you a feeling of who Stanley Thompson was. When he died, Judge Henry Howitt, who was his executor, called his creditors to Dormy House, where he lived. He owed an enormous amount of money, collectively around $500,000, 1953, translate into today's money. The creditors were obviously not very happy, but in the end, each and every one of them agreed to forgive Stanley his debts. And somebody said, well, why is this? Because Stanley did more for us than we did for him.
Really, all I have to say is, first of all, thank all of you for being here this afternoon, but more specifically, to thank these 4 gentlemen for what I thought was an absolutely fabulous afternoon.